Iron Maiden's ninth album is Fear of the Dark, came out in 1992, and definitely marks the end of an era for Iron Maiden. This would be the last album that they would do with Bruce Dickinson for, I think, about 6 years. It's also the last album that Martin Birch would ever work with the band. He would retire soon after this album's release, even though he was already playing less of a part in production with this album and the previous album, No Prayer for the Dying. Now, the production element is actually quite interesting on this album. It's definitely not as good as the work they were doing with the 80s, but it's definitely quite a bit of an improvement over No Prayer for the Dying. Now, Steve took his barn, which they recorded No Prayer for the Dying in, and turned it into an actual studio, Now everything was a bit more, like a proper studio, They kind of got a bit more serious about the production now. And in a way, in some certain elements, they kind of return to that epic feel that they had in the 80s, though definitely not as much as they had in the 80s. It's definitely an improvement over the very raunchy sound of the 90s that I wasn't a particularly big fan of for that point in Iron Maiden. And, overall the production's just a little bit cleaner, you can hear the instruments better. Steve's finally playing some good bass, really audible bass now. And yeah, everything overall just sounds a bit better. Now, Bruce's singing style is definitely an improvement, though he still uses the raspy thing way too much. It's definitely less than it was on No Prayer for the Dying. Now he's kind of using it when it's appropriate, but it's still on most of the tracks, which is just not very good, and is definitely one of the main problems with this album. This is by no means a perfect album, though I can say it is a vast improvement over No Prayer for the Dying. And yeah, as I've said, the bass is better. Overall, this album is kind of like No Prayer for the Dying, but a little bit better. All of the elements are there from No Prayer for the Dying, because this is still kind of early 90s era, which is No Prayer for the Dying, Fear of the Dark, and all the live albums that they did, which is generally considered a much weaker time for Iron Maiden, but it's definitely, you can't just put it with No Prayer and say, yeah, that's bad Iron Maiden, don't listen to that. It's definitely worth a chance, whereas No Prayer for the Dying, I would tell average listeners, it's not even worth a chance, don't even bother with it. Whereas this definitely has some pretty good tracks that definitely you should listen to, Iron Maiden fan or not, they're still good songs. Also, another thing, this finally has an epic, Fear of the Dark, which we will talk about in the track by track. And overall, this album is a lot more varied. It's a lot more like something like Power Slave, where there's variation in tempo, in Bruce's doing some more singing styles, some more studio effects, It's a lot more variation in the album, whereas No Prayer for the Dying was just so much of the same, that got really boring. But this feels like you can listen to it and then really feel like you're progressing through, because there's so many different elements. Now, the way kind of I see this album is the first 3 tracks and the last 3 tracks are probably the stronger parts of this album, though not strictly speaking, there are some exceptions. And the kind of middle 6 tracks all are kind of not very strong, kind of turn into mush, and you can't really distinguish them. Again, there's exceptions. There's some pretty good tracks, but that's kind of how the album feels. It's like half of it's actually pretty good Iron Maiden, and half of it's not really as strong as I would expect from Iron Maiden. And yeah, so without further ado, let's just talk a bit about the actual songs, and then I may elaborate on some elements as I'm doing that. Now, the first track is Be Quick or Be Dead, and this is quite a famous song off this album. And right off the bat, it is way faster than anything they were doing on No Prayer, which is just so good to hear, Finally, a good, fast opener, that, classic Iron Maiden upbeat style. I just love this track so much. It's one of the best tracks on this album. And, it's really catchy, but then, Bruce starts singing, and here we go. The problem with this whole entire album, the raspy thing, but I don't want to keep repeating myself, so unless I mention otherwise, assume that Bruce does the whole raspy thing, okay? But yeah, this has some pretty good riffs in there, and I like it because it's fast and feels like classic Maiden. And the next song is From Here to Eternity. Now, I don't know why, but this song gets bashed a lot, and I can kind of see why. It does kind of sound like something Motley Crue would write, but I think it's, like, catchy as hell. Like, catchy. Like, this song is not, like, the most complex, best song Maiden's ever written, but it's just really catchy, really addictive. It's a really upbeat song as well. So I actually like it. It kind of has an anthemic feel that I like it when it's not too many. Like, I like about one anthem on an album is like the maximum. But I do quite like anthemic styles of singing and anthemic tracks. So yeah, I actually quite enjoy this song, even though a lot of people would not agree with me on that. But anyway, Afraid to Shoot Strangers. Now, before we talk about the music, let's talk about another element in this album, and that is kind of similar to No Prayer. This is lyrically a lot different to what they were doing in the 80s. This is more about current events, about politics, about that sort of stuff, whereas deviating away from the sort of sci-fi fantasy kind of stuff they were doing in the 80s, and I actually quite like it on this album. Now, Afraid to Shoot Strangers in particular is about the soldiers in the Gulf War at the time, and obviously this time period is quite a political time period for really late 80s and early 90s, because the Cold War was ending and other wars like the Gulf War was starting. So yeah, and actually talking about the music, it has quite a slow, somber intro, which again adds to the variation element of this album that I really like. And yeah, it's got a good riff and really good rhythm that kind of sounds like Hallowed Be Thy Name. I'm not saying they just ripped off Hallowed Be Thy Name, but if you listen in, you can tell the rhythm kind of sounds like Hallowed Be Thy Name, which is good, you know. It's not like completely copying, but I do quite like it. And overall, I think this is honestly one of the strongest tracks, if not the strongest track. It's a little bit longer, but it doesn't feel that long. It feels like there's enough content there to support, I think 6.5 minutes or 7-minute length. And then this is the point in the album where we start the kind of middle part, where a lot of the songs aren't really able, in my opinion, to distinguish themselves. It should kind of blends together. And the first of these is Fear Is the Key. And the main weakness with this track is it's just a weak riff. The riff isn't very good. It's not really catchy at all. And it just doesn't really feel like it's progressing, you know. It's just kind of weak riff, nothing really special about it. Moving on, Childhoods, and this is a little bit better, but still just an okay riff, and they repeat things too many times. The repetition factor is definitely not as bad as it was on No Prayer for the Dying, simply because this has more variation, more elements to it, but yeah, this song in particular kind of repeats itself a little bit. Anyway, next track is Wasting Love, and again, this is pretty mediocre. Has a slow opening that's pretty good, you know. Bruce is doing the raspy thing, but he still can sing the slow stuff pretty good at this point. And yeah, when it speeds up, it's just kind of not that strong when it speeds up, to be honest. This kind of feels like a bit of a throwaway because it's not that great and nothing really that special about it. And the next track is The Fugitive, and again, mediocre riff, nothing that particular special. Weak chorus, but it's not too bad, you know. A lot of these songs aren't too bad, you know, but yeah, moving on. The next track is Chains of Misery, and this is kind of catchy, and it's kind of okay. Sorry about that. It's kind of okay, and it has some cool vocal effects, you know, with chorus, Chains of Misery, you know, repeating that line. And yeah, but just, again, not particularly strong, you know, nothing really that really excites you, like a lot of the stuff they were doing in the 80s. Anyway, the next track is The Apparition, and this track has a cool guitar line. Right before the solo, they do a really cool guitar line. I'm not sure if it's Yannick that does it, or Dave, or both possibly, but anyway, it's a really good guitar line, and it's a pretty catchy groove, but again, it kind of gets repetitive, but yeah, it's got a good groove in there, and I quite like it. It's okay. And then the next track is Judas Be My Guide. Now this starts the sort of last quarter of the album, which I also think is quite strong, and Judas Be My Guide is just an excellent song. It's got a really good intro, and it has one of the better guitar solos, you know. A lot of the guitar solos on this album aren't really that memorable, but this has one of the more memorable guitar solos, that is definitely sure, and it's catchy chorus and just good Iron Maiden kind of stuff. And then the second to last track is Weekend Warrior. Now this is not that great, but it's definitely a pretty good song. Again, has a pretty good solo in there, and it's a bit lyrically repetitive, but I like it, and it has way too many tempo shifts, and this is kind of a bit more of a technical thing, but they keep going from slow to fast to slow to fast to slow to fast, and until it just gets awkward. And usually on kind of ballads or slower tracks, it's slow, and then it goes fast, and then that's it. You don't keep switching, and when you keep switching, it just kind of gets awkward, to be honest. But anyway, pretty good track, Weekend Warrior. Last track, Fear of the Dark, the actual epic. It's about 8 minutes long, and before I talk about it, it's probably Iron Maiden's most overrated song. But that's not saying it's bad. It's just ridiculously overrated, you know. It's often, like, hailed as some, like, great, like, one of Steve Harris' best epics, even though it's not as good as Hallowed Be Thy Name, Rhyme the Ancient Mariner, Alexander the Great, Seventh Son. It's not as good as any of those songs. Maybe even To Tame a Land, to be honest. But, nonetheless, it's a good song. Comes out with a very, very, very good riff. But lyrically, it's nothing that special, kind of Fear of the Dark, and kind of playing on this whole Halloween thing that Iron Maiden were doing at this time, which is another element about this whole period of time. Iron Maiden was becoming, you know, a very kind of Halloween-ish kind of a band, which I'm not a big fan of, to be honest. That's not really Iron Maiden to me. But besides the good riff and a pretty haunting intro, I do quite like that intro. It sets up a cool vibe and a cool atmosphere. The song's really not one of Steve's best epics, but it's definitely them having a okay epic is better than having no epic on No Prayer for the Dying. But anyway, yeah, I'm not going to talk that much about it because it's not really that. It's not Seventh Son, it's not Rhyme the Ancient Mariner, it's nothing to go on for minutes about. But that concludes the track list. Now, overall, Fear of the Dark is definitely a very mixed bag, you know. You get a lot of people just putting it directly in No Prayer for the Dying, saying it's just this whole Iron Maiden early 90s era before Blaze, and it's just bad. And then you got other people hailing it as some really, like, amazing album, like up there with Power Slave and Seventh Son. And I have always been kind of in the middle of these two camps. They're definitely way, way better than No Prayer for the Dying, and definitely has some really good elements. But in a lot of ways, they took a lot of the stuff from No Prayer for the Dying, kept doing it, but made it a little bit better. You know, Bruce wasn't singing as raspy. The production is a little bit better. The musicianship is a little bit better. Stylistically, this is a little bit more epic, a little bit more complex, and that's kind of a good way to summarize it, in my mind at least. But yeah, that's Fear of the Dark. I am going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. Later.